Thanks for the opportunity to present my talk. And so let me introduce Michael. Michael Park is a fifth-year doctoral student, and I can very safely and with the confidence to say he's my right-hand man. I can't run project without him. So Michael, undergrad education was in history at the University of Georgia, and came to SSA for his master's. And he started quickly working for my project ever since. So although he's fifth year, it's his seventh year working with me. And on the side, he is also getting a master's in public health. And he came without any statistical background. As I say, he was a historian, but now he's getting a master's in statistics as well. And Michael took statistics class while he was a master's student. He took my doctoral class. So we have been working for a long time, and he's sort of a student that any faculty would dream to have. And I really appreciate the opportunity that we get to present this talk together. And I think maybe he was going to talk, but he's part of the talk is a paper that he developed out of a class on social support. So completely independent. He saw a very interesting topic and how that influenced Asian American youth, especially in how that can mitigate some of the detrimental effect of racial discrimination that we're going to just talk about. So I think this is really good messages for all doctoral students that when you write a term paper for your class, that could actually potentially turn into a publication. So, the topic today is mitigating the detrimental effect of racial discrimination. And actually, we're going to talk about two papers. But I would like to devote more time for Michael to talk about his paper. And the racial discrimination is rampant nowadays. And not just even before this happened, I wanted to bring your attention to Asian American paradox, we call it. So youth problems tend to co-occur, meaning that children who are antisocial, however that we define, and typically in this case, we're talking about a lot of conduct disorders, for instance, acting out, or getting into fight, or stealing, and those type of antisocial behaviors. So when kids are antisocial, they tend to report also higher rates of mental distress and substance use, and they all tend to sort of mingle and happen together. Because youth, when they're distressed, they tend to act out. They can't often verbalize their frustration or their anxiety and depression. So my early works on focusing on substance use and antisocial behaviors were actually funded by NIMH, the National Institute of Mental Health, because there is a consensus that children's mental health and behaviors are highly intercorrelated. So that's usually the pattern. However, the Asian American sort of breaks this pattern by behaving sort of as an aggregate. I always say as an aggregate, because if you start to look at individual groups, we start to see a different pattern. But Asian American as an aggregate, they do report less externalizing problem behaviors, like antisocial behaviors and substance use. But then there's also a caveat that once they start to use substance use, they use a lot. So that's a different story. But again, as an aggregate and as a sort of the general indicator of problems, that they do report less externalizing problem behaviors and less substance use, and pretty good grades as a group. But they do report high rates of mental health distress, social anxiety and depressive symptoms and suicidal behaviors or ideations. So though, of course, the question is why? Why is that they do seem to sort of behave well and but then not happy? And this is a huge problem for social workers because these children's problems will be undetected because they would look fine and they're behaving well. So the sort of internal struggles are not really well detected and it's really hard to prevent. And especially when the consequences are like suicide, like dire consequence and tragic, often people wonder what happened, what did we miss? So that's what got me really going to this direction of the research. And most of the studies have suggested that maybe the factors that leads to this paradox may be in the family process or that there's sort of the context, social context. So being growing up in an immigrant family and as a racial ethnic minority might be able to help to explain those paradoxes. So any of you who came to my talk last week at demography workshop, I talked a lot about the family process, the Asian American family process. That's a combination of endogenous Asian cultures and also immigrant ethos and also culturation. So all those sort of things all happen together to maybe to explain paradox. Today I would like to talk about more the external factors outside of the family. So racism, especially explicit and blatant racism, studies have shown that it triggers anger in people. But implicit and structural racism produces mental health problems like mental distress, meaning that when people experience something unfair and unjust, and if it's not blatant outward, then people have to go home and figure out what happened. And then that really produces long-lasting effect of the negative impact. So just to very briefly, we know current socio-political climate is highly stressful. I take a pause because it's really, really stressful. The day that you think we have hit the bottom, we always we go lower. So I don't know whether there's any bottom to this. But race and immigration has been at the center of politics today. And surge in overt racism, like blatant racism, and dramatic increases in hate crimes. And white nationalism that used to be on the fringe is now at the center stage. And there's an increased hostility, fear-mongering, and xenophobia. And it's so often that we hear, I mean, not only it's documented, it sort of happens and you feel it in your daily life. And at the same time, the structural, implicit racism continues. The truth is that because of the blatant racism and its surge, those implicit and structural racism looked pale compared to what happens. So we still have a long way to go to achieve a just society, but we're going, seems like, 8 steps backward. So we have plenty of evidence of perpetuated racism, let alone the hate crimes or blatant racism. There's a whole lot of things that we can think of. And especially Asian Americans remain invisible. And Filipinos among Asian Americans, when we said Asian Americans, there are at least 17 different nationality groups. So it's such a really big pen categories, and Filipino and among the Asian people call it invisible among the invisible. Because when people think of Asian Americans, often they think about Chinese and some of the big groups, but actually Filipinos often is the second largest, if not the largest subgroup. But they have very unique, different needs, and which is often overlooked. And in terms of inequality, recent studies shows that income inequality is the greatest among Asian Americans. So even if you can always say, well, so-and-so I know really are rich, and Asian Americans are really rich, that's also coupled with the people who are struggling and in poverty. But because we often address issues as average, they tend to get overlooked in social service needs and everything else. And Asian American, again, are coined as a model minority, and no matter how much I wish I could really debunk the stereotype, it's really persistent. Because no matter how much you provide empirical evidence, the public perception is really hard to change. And they think it's great to be called honorary white. And so the typical sort of the characteristic is that they're problem-free, and even if they have problems, they will sort of self-care for the problems, and they will sort of take care of themselves. They're hardworking. But even these sort of the seemingly positive, positive stereotypes, it has reasons why they're there, and then also it's coupled with the many negative ones. And even if they do well, and even if that's true, which is not really, that also they're regarded as foreigners no matter what. So I often, one of the book chapters that I wrote, Asian American children who are born here, second, third generation, they're being told to go back your home country, right? They don't have home to go back. So that's sort of the reality of the environment. And often they're cut in right in the middle. So there is a theory called middleman minority theory that often Asians are right in the middle. So they're not white, but they're not counted as minority, and they're used against other minorities. And racial triangulation theory that actually Michael is used in his dissertation talks about how Asian Americans are sort of portrayed as model minority, so use that to oppress blacks and Latinx, but then call them a foreigner so that it doesn't really legitimize their existence here. And Asian American youth growing up in this kind of environment actually do report the highest rate of peer harassment that's done by both majority group and also other minority groups. I'm trying to rush so that Michael has more time, but maybe I should slow down. So what's happening is what's happening, and as much as we would like to reduce the incidence of racism and all that, it's going to happen, it's happening. So the tasks of social workers and parents as well is that how are we going to mitigate this effect when it happens? Things happen. But how we're going to sort of reduce at least the negative impact of racism. So although I did put social support first, because Michael is going to talk about it, ethnic identity has been proposed over or 3 decades or so, as the prime sort of the mitigating effect variable. So today what we're going to talk about is that how to improve or how to strengthen ethnic identity in the family. So that's for the parents. Also, a new emerging area is a social support. So the marriage of social support and racism, and how social support can mitigate the negative impact of racial discrimination. So social support, there's different ways to look at it, but there's different types and different sources. So in terms of types, there are instrumental support and emotional support, which Michael is going to go more in detail. You can also think about different sources of support. They could come from family, they could come from your friends or schools and community and other surroundings. And racial ethnic socialization, there's a paper that I'm going to talk about, but I will see how much time we have when Michael is done. But pretty much this process has at least 3 components. Where cultural socialization, that parents are trying to sort of immerse their children in the culture of origin and then pass on their traditions and cultural traits. And for instance, taking the kids to the culture of origin or country of origin to visit, or do that's sort of the traditional holiday observations and those kind of things. And there's also ways that parents can promote distrust, tell their kids, you don't trust anyone else. And especially this is heightened when parents experience racial discrimination themselves. Also, preparation for bias. Instead of telling your kids, just go do whatever, actually prepare them that you may experience X, Y, and Z, and when it happens, you want to respond to this and that way. So there's that active socialization process you can imagine. And these, again, the racial discrimination experience by parents and children respectively contribute to shape the racial and ethnic socialization, and especially the racial discrimination seems to influence promotion of mistrust and preparation for bias. So that's something that we're going to talk about after Mike's talk. So why Filipino and Korean Americans? And that's my current focus of the research. Again, there's a lot of different, at least 17, I said, nationality groups. But some of the groups like Hmong, they don't count as a national, the group with a nationality, because they didn't have a nation before they immigrated. And there were sort of the tribal people who lived in the mountains between, say, Cambodia and Vietnam, and they got involved in Vietnam War, and they helped out American Army, American government. So after the war ended, they were in danger. So they came here as refugees. So when we said 17 nationalities and countries, Hmong doesn't count in that count. And even within the group, say, Chinese and Indians, there's a multiple different language groups that they can't communicate with one another. So that's also such a big category to lump people together. So Asian Americans are extremely diverse. So you can pick and choose a lot of different groups, but I chose these two for very strategic reasons, because I argue that they really provide an interesting contrast that we can extract a lot of information from. So first of all, these two groups are one of the among the top 5 most populous Asian Americans. So this is a relative term. But the ways in which they are situated in terms of acculturation is a really interesting one. So Filipinos were colonized by U.S. for over 100 years before they became independent. And even prior to that, they were colonized by Spain for 300 years. So they have a history of 400 years of colonization. So before they came, people often say they have started their assimilation process already in the country of origin. So Filipino parents, unlike majority of other Asian parents are fluent in English, and they do see themselves, their sort of the cultural practice, a lot of aspects are, say, assimilated, meaning their job tend to be in the mainstream. And residentially, they're not concentrated, they're much more spread out, so they're much more integrated. And although they do have a strong ethnic identity, they also have very strong affiliation to American culture. But in contrast, Koreans are almost at the exact opposite. So Koreans are known to have limited English ability, and they're least acculturated, so people coin them as most separated group. So if you look at sort of their spectrum, one is here, one is on the other hand. But interestingly, if you look at family process, Filipinos are more traditional Asian than Koreans. So there's a lot of different contrast that's coming. And when I did a study with the children, unlike their parent generations, there were more commonalities across these groups. So they both, regardless of whether they're Filipino or Korean, they are growing up American in this country. So you actually see much more commonalities. Both groups have high and very strong ethnic identity. But if you look at their developmental patterns, it also divergent and convergent. So in terms of external behaviors, the Filipinos do struggle. If you, not only just among Asian Americans, if you compare their rates of external behaviors to other groups, they are a struggling group. Koreans in the opposite way, they do really well as a group. But if you look at mental distress, they both report troubling rates of mental distress problems. So one fits, like Koreans fits the paradox better than Filipinos, but we assume that they're all Asian Americans. So that's one of the reasons that I choose these two groups to provide more interesting information. And so in the face of all this racial discrimination, overt, covert, all types, how Filipino and Korean American parents respond? What do they teach their children? So that's something interesting. And also how children respond to these. Are they more stressed out or not by ethnic groups or by what other factors? So that's the main topics of the study. Yeah. Oh, still. So I will go faster. So currently I'm conducting this study called Midwest Longitudinal Study of Asian Americans. I did a contest among my students, and so it's the name that they came up with, Study of Asian American Families. They won a gift card. But I added Midwest Longitudinal at the front with a grandiose plan that I will make it as a national longitudinal study of Asian American families. You can always dream big. That's fun. So we started the study 2013 with the measurement development, and 2014 we started the first wave of the data. So Midwest families, pretty much Chicago and 5 actually surrounding counties, families whose mom is of Korean and Filipino descent. And the first wave, it took about 8 months that we were able to collect 800 families 380 Filipino families and a little over 400 Korean families. And we completed wave 2 and wave 3. And we had a good retention at wave 2, but wave 3, we were able to bring all of the wave 2 families and some of the wave 1 family who did not participate in wave 2 as well. So it was an in-person interview that we asked, unless the parents or children strongly preferred doing it alone survey. And we translate them all to Korean and Tagalog and English so they could choose. But only 8% of the children chose their the heritage language version, meaning that they all did mostly English one. So they're about 15 years old in both groups, about equal gender distribution. Filipinos were more likely to be foreign-born, US-born than Korean-born. And among the foreign-born, the average years of living is about 8 to 9 years, meaning that much of their socialization occurred here. So they're Asian Americans. And the parents' data, they're mostly moms. We asked for primary caretakers, so they're mostly moms and mostly foreign-born, and more so among Korean Americans. And they live in US about 20-something years for Filipino and like 15, 16 years for Koreans. They're a heavily married group and employed and college educated. And this is sort of the national profile of the both groups. So again, there's two sets of analysis that we would like to introduce today. The first one is that how different types of social support, the emotional and instrumental support that moderate, meaning mediate the negative impact of perceived racial discrimination. And second paper that I'm going to talk about is that mediating process of racial ethnic socialization. So like when parents and children experience racial discrimination, how does that relate to ethnic identity and what happens in the racial and ethnic socialization process? So now it's going to be Michael.
Okay, I don't know why, but I think I'm more nervous than when I defended my proposal. But I'll do my best. So this first study is interested in understanding how social support, especially two types of support, including emotional and instrumental support, and how they can potentially alleviate or potentially worsen the negative influence of racial discrimination on both depressive symptoms and GPA score. Then we'll further examine whether these moderating relationships will further vary by nativity status, simply by comparing the US-born group versus foreign-born group within the sample. Before I dive into how social support plays its roles in these complex relationships, I'll briefly introduce what this social support actually is. According to social network theory, social support refers to a broad range of resources that can actually transfer resources across social relationships. For example, if you have a child, you would know taking care of the baby all day long by yourself will be very exhausted, especially when you have a presentation next day. And when you are short of money, having someone like your parents or your close friends who could lend you some money to pay the bills will be a great support in financial difficulties. Although this is a simple anecdotal example for myself, literature have shown that social support is actually, it is theorized and empirically tested for decades to have both direct and indirect benefits across ages and ethnic racial backgrounds. And it can be further distinguished by its types, including emotional and instrumental support. Emotional support, on the one hand, can help distressed individuals with negative feelings by talking with significant others, as an example that I gave. But on the other hand, instrumental support can provide more tangible resources like financial support to the distressed individuals. Although social support literature have identified this differential functions by types of support, few have explored how these different types may play its role in the moderating relationships. In fact, most of the studies on this field have focused on the global social support measure instead of examining how the subgroups differs by these types. But we could get some hints from the coping literature, which explore a lot on how different styles of coping may have different roles in this, when they face adversity. For example, they found problem-focused coping is more adaptive in face of adversity, while emotion-focused coping is maladaptive. They hypothesize that the problem-focused coping is more adaptive because they tend to focus directly on the problems that they're facing, while emotion-focused coping may be maladaptive because it tries to reduce, for example, negative emotional reactions rather than directly dealing with the problems they are encountering. But they do recognize that this may not be always the case, but it may also depend upon certain contextual factors. For example, Dr. No and his colleague in their 2003 study with two-way interaction study, they found problem focus may be adaptive and emotion focus may be maladaptive, as aligning with other coping literature. But once they account for the contextual factors in their three-way interaction study, within the same study, they found that individuals who are more acculturated into the mainstream society, meaning who are more familiar with the American society, they tend to benefit more from the problem-focused coping because they know how to navigate the system and benefit more from this direct problem-focused coping resources. But they also found that individuals with strong co-ethnic support, which is a rough indicator of individuals being less acculturated into the American society, they tend to benefit more from emotion-focused coping. So although these ample studies have identified different functions played by these different types of coping styles, few specifically have focused on how different emotional versus instrumental support can play their roles in the moderating relationships. Also, as Dr. Choi has addressed, because of the moderate minority stereotype, this study has often neglected Asian American youth in general. Also, few studies have explored how this moderating relationship may potentially be varied by nativity status. Most of the three-way interaction studies that have focused on this field have explored some of the conventional acculturation indicators like ethnic identity or ethnic cultural practices. Although we do think acculturation indicators like this and nativity are highly correlated, we do believe nativity has a unique effect that can additionally explain some of the variances that these conventional indicators cannot fully explain by itself. To address these gaps in the literature, we ran 3 separate analyses. In the first analysis, we regressed wave 1 outcomes on wave 1 predictors to examine the concurrent relationship. I think there's a typo, right? In the longitudinal model, we regressed wave 2 outcomes on wave 1 predictors to examine the longitudinal relationship. But in the final model, we regressed wave 2 outcomes on wave 1 predictors, additionally adjusting for wave 1 outcomes. Because literature has shown that youth previous behaviors or outcomes are one of the most significant predictors of their current outcomes. So we wanted to examine whether certain predictors can predict youth outcomes above and beyond their previous youth outcomes. Within these 3 separate analyses, we ran hierarchical regression analysis. The first model, in the first step, we included demographic characteristics and the main effect of racial discrimination and emotional and instrumental support. These demographic characteristics included nativity, gender, ethnicity, youth age, and their household income to address for their house socioeconomic status. In the second step, to examine how this relationship between racial discrimination and youth outcomes vary by the level of social support. We included two-way interaction terms. In the final step, we additionally included three-way interaction terms to examine how these moderating effects that we identified in second step, how they will further vary by nativity status. And this is the output for the main effects, or the step 1 model, which is hard to see. And this is the output for step 2 and 3 models. If there was any significant interaction effects or interaction terms, then we additionally tested for a likelihood ratio test. So we wanted to see whether including additional interaction terms could increase the model fit. If it does increase the model fit, then we plot the graph and examine how the slopes were different across these subgroups. So I'll summarize these results in words. So summarizing the results from step 1, we found, as expected, the significant negative impact of racial discrimination on both youth depressive symptoms and their GPA score. That is, as the level of youth perceived racial discrimination increased, their depressive symptoms increased and their GPA score would decreased. And this negative impact was more persistent with their depressive symptoms than their GPA score. That is, we found that the significant positive relationship between racial discrimination and depressive symptoms in concurrent and longitudinal model, even after we adjust for their previous youth outcomes. On the other hand, with regards to GPA, we only found significant negative association between racial discrimination and depressive symptoms only in the concurrent model. We also found a significant impact of significant impact of emotional and instrumental support in reducing depressive symptoms level, especially emotional support on both concurrent and longitudinal model, while instrumental support only in the concurrent model. Summarizing the results from the two-way interaction model, we found the differential roles played by emotional and instrumental support in the face of racial discrimination. More specifically, the positive association between racial discrimination and depressive symptoms were strengthened by emotional support, while instrumental support weakened this relationship. In other words, the negative impact was more worsened by emotional support, but this negative impact was reduced when there was strong instrumental support present. We also found a significant protective effects of instrumental support with GPA score as well. So these sort of study findings are aligned with the previous coping literature that problem-focused coping, such as instrumental support, is adaptive, while emotional-focused coping like emotional support may be maladaptive in face of adversity. The findings from the three-way interaction indicates that youth who are US-born tend to benefit more from instrumental support, while individuals who are foreign-born tend to benefit more from emotional support. And this is also aligning with the Dr. No's study finding with adult population, although the individuals who are highly acculturated tend to benefit more from direct problem-focused coping, while individuals who get more support from co-ethnic support, which is a rough indicator of less acculturation, tend to benefit more from emotion-focused coping. And we also conducted sensitivity analysis to examine whether these study findings are sensitive to the potential confounders that we didn't include it in this original model. In other words, we wanted to see whether additionally adjusting for certain predictors changed the significance of our study findings. So as guided by the literature, we found an extensive list of acculturation indicators, including American or English language proficiency, ethnic language proficiency, ethnic and American cultural practices, and then both ethnic and American identities, along with years living in the US. So even after we adjusted for this extensive list of acculturation indicators, we still found all the significant findings at the 0.5 significance level. So that sort of indicates that these results are sort of robust on the potential confounders that we didn't include it. And this is the graph that we plotted for three-way interaction with emotional support. And this is the plot for instrumental support, which I summarized in the previous slides. And this is the significant slope test across the subgroups that we have here. In summary, the current study empirically tested and confirmed the significant negative association between racial discrimination and youth developmental outcomes, both depressive symptoms and their school performance. But we found more persistent negative impact on their mental health than their school performance. We also found that social support may be not universally positive, but may be dependent upon certain its types or depending on the outcomes of interest. Also, although we only examined the subgroup difference across nativity, we also think it is very critical to examine how the subgroup differs by ethnicity and gender. Although I didn't present just before, but we also ran sensitivity analysis across ethnicity. So we ran the whole set of analysis only with Filipino population. Then we ran the same procedure only with Korean population. And what we found was that all the significant interaction effects related to depressive symptoms were only found among Filipino youth, while all the significant interactions related to GPA score was only salient among Korean youth population. So this clearly indicates that there are some subgroup differences across ethnicity. So initially, we included all three-way interaction effects in the one paper. We tried to include interactions by nativity, gender, and ethnicity, but then it became too complicated, so we decided to drop the other two interactions. But this is clearly the projects that we are still working on and will be the future project that we'll present. I think, yeah.
So in case that you guys wondered how we measured emotional support versus instrumental support, the emotional support were mostly whether you have someone to talk to, like your friends, teachers, or parents. Versus instrumental support is that when you need help, whether you can get the help, and whether your friends are ready, so to speak, to help you, your teachers and parents. And so the R1 is much more of having someone to talk to and vent when they're frustrated, versus the other one is getting a lot of problem-focused actual help. And so in part this...
Can you also say how you measure discrimination?
So discrimination, it's a multiple scale. I think we have it on the slide.
Yes,
Do you want to find it?
Oh, actually, we don't have items itself, but...
Oh, it doesn't show when you do this. I'm learning every day.
So it asked whether they were discriminated by white or other Asian Americans, or... Oh, it doesn't show up here.
Was it perceived discrimination?
Yeah, so we said perceived discrimination, and the reason that usually there's a modifier to perceived to racial discrimination is because sometimes when people are discriminated, they may not even realize. So this is what we say perceived discrimination, because this is how they have perceived experiencing the discrimination. So it was multiple items, and we asked whether they've been discriminated by whites, other minorities, and other Asians.
Also, whether my teacher treated me unfairly because
Unfairly.
of my ethnicity, or
Right.
kids at school treated me unfairly because I'm Korean or Filipino.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, did you distinguish in the questions between the ethnicity questions and like a broader kind of identification
Right, so in the first wave, I think until the second wave, we had sort of the separated out. But then there's emerging literature that talks about what about children, especially building or developing pan-ethnic identity. So for instance, instead of say, do you identify yourself as American and then Korean, we actually added on the question, do you identify yourself as Korean American or do you identify yourself as Asian American? Because it's a progress from identify yourself as mainly as the heritage group and then move on. But at least what has shown in our analysis that when kids say, I feel Korean, they don't mean to say they feel Korean in Korea. What they often mean is that they're Korean American. So at least in the survey item, that really didn't distinguish. Yes.
Measure depression, and then also how you decided to focus in on depression as the primary mental health thing.
So we have several things, but depression was the children's depression inventory scale that's been used widely. So and so that there's sort of feeling of mood a week before the survey. And why depression? Because among the mental distress, the Asians report high rates of depressive symptoms and social anxiety and other things. But we have decided to depressive symptoms because that seemed to most correlated to suicidal ideations and suicides. And self-harming behaviors among Asian American women is really high too, and that's also related to depressive symptoms. And we wanted to contrast between external versus internal outcomes. And in part, the findings of the study shows that the ways in which that racial discrimination impacts mental distress quite strongly, but less so on GPA, in part explains the paradox that we were trying to explain. Yes?
I know this is a departure from the main focus of this study, but I wonder if based on these results you can speculate how you might find results in a similar study conducted on Asian American adoptees. I imagine they would fit under the category of being in more similar, or I forget the terminology used, but a culturally acculturated group. If they're with a otherwise white family, but I just wonder if you could speak to that.
I will not be able to speak with confidence because I don't have the data. But much of the study done on adoptees, international adoptees or transracial adoptee study have some of the very similar sort of threads of findings that the children do better when they feel positive about their root. But the complexity of the context and families that they're dealing with is much more dramatically complicated. So, yeah, I will stop there.
There's also Rowena Fong at the University of Texas School of Social Work who has done some really excellent work on Asian American adoptees.
Yeah. And typically, some of the scholars who do Asian Americans also do adoptees studies, and I've been focusing just this.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Michael was pointing to someone else.
No. Any of us can answer questions.
So I was just wondering, when you were deciding on what measures to use, did you consider looking at what neighborhoods that these folks are coming from? I'm just wondering, if they're living in a context where there are many other, Koreans or many other Filipinos, how that would affect their responses. I know you would get to that with the racial ethnic identity and everything, but I think that might have another impact as well.
So I will pass on to Michael, but he was taking geocoding type of class, and whenever he takes a class, he writes a paper. So he also, that's one of the things that he's doing. So looking at where children live in the neighborhood, because we can connect their address to the FIPS code, which provides us the composition of the neighborhood and not only racial ethnic diversity, a lot of economic conditions. And do you want to speak to that a little?
So I took geocoding classes, so I was interested in whether living in more ethnic enclave, because there is a theory out there talking about if youth living in more co-ethnic enclaves, they tend to do better. But most of the studies from the sociology focus on their socioeconomic status. But I was interested in whether living in that neighborhood actually helps them with their mental health outcomes. And it's still ongoing process that I'm analyzing this study. But what I found was they tend to do better when they have more Asian American youth around. But I couldn't find much of the co-ethnic benefits.
And then another question is, I was wondering if you have any hypotheses for explaining the subgroup differences?
With
The nativity?
To the connection between like the GPA versus
depressive symptoms. So this is sort of exploratory study, so I can't speak in confidence. But what I understand is, as Dr. Choi has addressed, Filipino youth tend to have more problems, or they have a higher rates of depressive symptoms, especially female youth. So I think they're more vulnerable with regards to depressive symptoms. While there's a whole literature, even back in their home countries and here, the Korean youth suffer a lot from the academic pressure. So I think they're more vulnerable with regards to GPA score.
Thanks for a great talk. This might have been in your presentation, and I might have missed it, but have you looked at over time if there's a difference, pre and post Trump, how people's levels of depression or perceived racism is showing up in the data?
So we were dying to find that too. Especially the wave 2 data, that bulk was done before the election. Although it's safe, I think we can say that the hostile environment occurred way before the election results. Of course, we're hoping that with the election it will end, but then it got amplified. So we have the data before and after, but maybe because the size is different or because the children are still young, we didn't see the drastic change. But that's one of the reasons that we would like to get more money to follow them, because some of the impact will be lasting, as we have seen. That it's not, even if it doesn't show like within that time, it will have negative impact, long-lasting impact. Yes.
First, great job, Michael. I'm
Thanks.
glad to see my colleagues' work is coming along. I think this is an excellent study, especially in a high needed area, to look at, what are the other positive, protective factors. And my question was, I know you mainly focused on emotional support and tangible support, but were you not able to look at cognitive support, which is guidance and mentorship, and especially you're looking at academic performance, and which could help them navigate their schooling and then acculturation process as well. So did you have that measure, or were you not just interested in?
So we don't have that cognitive support measures, but we did explore before how different sources of support, like support from their school teachers or students in the same class, how that may have different impacts on youth outcomes. But then we thought it was too complicated, and the literature out there has showing mixed findings that so there's like really complicated, and we think there are some interaction effects by the source and types of support, but then the data that we had and the questions items that we had couldn't really support to do more diverse analysis like that. But I think it is very critical to examine that as well in terms of specifically with the GPA, school performance outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the article that recently and that we worked on and it's published. So when we looked at the sample of aging out foster youth, we also looked at the social support types and sources, and then cognitive support more likely to come from professionals. They're in interaction with school staff and their service providers, and then in their emotional support, will likely to come from their families and peers. So that was the pairing, the division of sources depending on where the division of their social support type, where it's coming from. So I thought it might be also interesting if you had a data measure. It would be interesting to look at.
But that also makes it difficult to
tease out if it's the type of support that matters or the source. And so it's, I mean, my sense from a lot of data sets that I've looked at is the types of support are too correlated to really tease apart. So they were lucky that they could differentiate it, and then also sources of support can be really, really correlated. So it's, conceptually, it makes sense that the source and the type should all be distinct or might have distinct implications for outcomes, but practically, it's often really tricky to tease that all out.
Right, and I think this is one of the examples where I didn't start this whole study with a focus on social support. So that sort of explains why we don't have the complexity maybe we should have. But my study has whole other focus, main focus. But this is how a student can actually expand it. So if I do get more funding, this is the area that I will expand. I'm not kidding. And that's what we have done even within the study from wave 1 and 2 and 3. As we were revising survey over the years, we integrated a lot to reflect Michael's, for instance, dissertation. It's not just to give him opportunity for the data analysis, because it was really meaningfully expanding the study. So social support is another new area that I didn't expect much. It's not my thing, but now it's gonna be one of my things. Yes?
Would you be able to provide some contextual insight or patterns in what the literature says about other immigrant groups or just like non-immigrant or non-white Americans on how emotional versus instrumental supports have been overcoming academic adversity for you?
The adversity from racial discrimination or just in general?
So as I expressed in the literature part, there isn't much study that talking about the moderating effects by the types of support. There are studies that examining the direct effects of different types of support, but then they haven't really moved forward to dissecting this type of support in terms of addressing or overcoming from this challenging life situation. But as the coping literature have shown, more direct instrumental support might be more beneficial generally, but emotional support might be more less helpful in certain sense. But as well, we do have to understand the contextual factors like their nativity in their picture. But I don't know much about, I can't speak much about other ethnic groups at this point.
Yeah.
Other questions? Then join me in thanking.
Well, we're not done yet.
Oh, you're not done?
You want me to be done?
No, you have plenty of time.
Actually, we haven't gone to the second study. I can always end, or I can talk for 5 hours if you want. So the second study I wanted to talk about is another study that actually, this also was a student-led. And one of my colleagues, David Takeuchi, currently at Boston College, is one of the investigators of the study. And his students, and also including Michael, proposed the study, and we have decided to examine the mechanisms in which how the racial discrimination influences ethnic identities and American identities, so dual culture identities, and how that, through the mechanism of how change, what kind of changes it has on racial ethnic socialization process. So we ran a structural equation modelings with a bootstrapping and maximum likelihood estimate. And here, the model that we're going to talk about is quite robust to the finding because we controlled lots of variables here. So just given the time, I'm just presenting this. If anybody is interested in more data information, I'll be happy to give it to you. So here, this is the model we tested. We also tested separately for Filipinos and Koreans. So this is a Filipino model. So the first one is the children's report of racial discrimination and also parents' report of discrimination and how that predicts racial socialization in the family. The top two constructs are report of the children, that how that the promotion of mistrust in the family and preparation for bias. And then last three are a parent report, the same promotion of mistrust and preparation for bias. and also concerns about children's minority status. So what we're hypothesizing is that when children or parents experience racial discrimination, that influence racial ethnic socialization process. And as we have hypothesized that the experience of racial discrimination increased these racial ethnic socialization process. And that's the first and second columns are all wave 1. And we were trying to see whether that predicts the ethnic identity and the wave 2. And that's also after controlling the level one, the ethnic identity in wave 1. So what we have found is that discrimination influences racial ethnic socialization by increasing all these aspects of racial ethnic socialization. But the ways in which that influenced children's ethnic identity was fully mediated by the racial socialization by increasing parents' promoting of mistrust of others among Filipinos, and also by increasing concern about children's minority status. But what's interesting is the impact on ethnic identity was not the same. So among Filipinos, promotion of mistrust actually decreased ethnic identity, so weakens ethnic identity. But their concern about their children being minority improved ethnic identity. And none of them had impact on American identity.
Can you explain a little more about what you mean by promotion of mistrust?
A promotion of mistrust, sort of telling your kids not to trust white people.
Okay.
That'll be sort of something else. So that's about, this is how you might be treated, and sort of preparing for bias. Like
Parents preparing children?
Yeah, for bias. Do we have specific?
Children prepare for bias.
So that's their report of how their parents prepare them for bias.
Right. So how often has your parent talked to you about racial ethnic stereotypes, prejudice, or discrimination against people of your race? Or talked to you about the unfair treatment that occurs due to race or ethnicity, something like that.
I know I should be able to do it from the model, but can you just repeat what the key findings are
Yes.
that you just said?
So after, can I show Korean too, and then?
Oh. Actually, that just answered my question. I was trying to figure out both the Filipino and the Korean. I didn't know that last time.
So this one is on Filipinos,
Okay, I got it now.
and this one is Koreans. And the same thing as Filipinos, that experience of racial discrimination has increased the children's report of racial ethnic socialization, as well as the parent report of racial and ethnic socialization. But among Koreans, the discrimination influenced, say, ethnic identity only through preparation of bias. And so that strengthened the children's ethnic identity.
So Korean, I'm just repeating. So Korean parents, in the face of discrimination, are likely to behave in all three of those ways, but only preparation of bias is related to youth identity.
Right. And for Filipinos, two other constructs had influence on ethnic identity, but in opposite direction.
Is it right, youth promotion of mistrust and preparation for bias is not related to ethnic identity?
Right, at least longitudinally. But it is somewhat different when you look at concurrent model. But we're showing the most rigorous model that we could establish. So actually, on the first point, promotion of mistrust, there is some literature that has documented that sort of promoting mistrust of other people in your children can actually backfire. That not only it compromises their ethnic identity, but also it's compromised their mental health too. So by sort of educating your children, do not trust anyone else and things that don't really seem to work well, versus Korean's case, the preparation bias, other studies also have shown that's sort of relate to instrumental support, I guess, like preparing your kids about concrete possible incident that kids may experience, and sort of preparing them to watch out for those. So again, the experiences of racial discriminations are fully mediated in a longitudinal model. That racial discrimination in wave 1 did not predict identity in wave 2 directly, but it was all through the family and ethnic socialization process. And it did not have influence on American identity. It only had an influence on ethnic identity. And subgroup difference that we have talked about is that racial discrimination was mediated by increasing promotion of mistrust and concern about minority status among Filipino families, and by increasing preparation for bias among Korean families that leads to ethnic identity. Yes?
I'm not ready to do this, but how would you translate those findings into recommendations for parents, Filipino?
So that's one of the things that I would love to do in my next step. And I have whole sets of findings on family process and also this racial socialization process. But sort of the stories that's emerging from the data analysis so far is the family wanted to provide more the instrumental and very problem-focused and concrete help to the children instead of just being there and listen and vent together, which will help to a certain degree. But what really helps the children's development is that sort of addressing the problems as they are. And I think that also includes the preparation for bias. And parenting too, which I didn't have a chance to talk about today much, is that there's an aspect that parents wanted to actually considering discarding in their sort of the traditional repertoire or traits. For instance, gendered process, like limiting girls to certain activities and expectations is harming to their mental health. That also explains in part the paradox why kids are doing so well in sort of the outside, but then they are suffering internally. That also explains the paradox as well as the translatable to prevention or interventions. And family-oriented activities really seem to help. And it has not only concurrent, but longitudinal impact. And another aspect that I'm ready to educate parents is that Asian parents stereotypically emphasize a lot on academic-oriented sort of activities, but the academically oriented control itself does not really relate to the problems. But when we control for other types of controls, the parent supervision, it can actually also backfire, especially on GPA. So if parents become so obsessed with the studies and nag the kids, beyond the sort of healthy rates of parental control, it's not going to help the children. So I have a sort of set of recommendations that I would like to translate.
And you would say they generalize across Korean and Filipino groups?
Yeah. So at least, one of the reasons that I chose these two groups is because they're so different. When we see the common findings in both groups, I figure that's safe to say that that's more generalizable. But when these two are different, also given that they are so in either a spectrum, we can consider different sort of the ways we can apply some of the findings. But in a way, most of the findings that's coming out of the study are almost commonsensical, but we can't develop interventions with a common sense. We have to do it with empirical data. So here we go. And without say, this is what I believe, I will just say this is what it shows. Mm-hmm. So here are some of the highlights again, is that when parents experience racial discrimination, that reinforces a racial ethnic socialization in the family. And the ways in which that it happens, it longitudinally influences ethnic identity development, although it varies across subgroups. And promotion of mistrust relative to preparation of bias or increased concern about children's minority status may in fact weaken ethnic identity. So sharing your children about reality is a good thing, but then promoting mistrust is not going to help your kids.